Hello, hello, gang, and welcome back to McFly's Movie House with me, Marta McFly. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're all as excited for today's episode as I am, because, this podcast, when I started it, it was such a treat for me to go back and just go through my favorite filmmakers' catalogs, revisit a bunch of their movies that just mean so, so much to me. And one of those filmmakers is Wim Wenders. And my journey with his filmography started where it does for most people, and that's by watching Paris, Texas. And my first viewing of it, I was just transfixed by this story, these landscapes as well. And things just kind of snowballed from there. I got deeper into his work. And when I was finally building episodes for this podcast, I really wanted to do an episode on Wenders himself. And I just couldn't for the life of me figure out what film or films to focus on because he has so many. And of course, Paris, Texas is very dear to me still. But my favorite movie of his also happens to be this one right here, Wings of Desire, for those of you that can see on video. And then, of course, last year as well, I watched Perfect Days, which ended up being my favorite of 2023. And so I decided, what am I going to do now? These are three different movies, three different time periods. And so I went back and really thought about Wenders' work and motifs commonly found in his films. And what I noticed was that all three of these movies, and many of his other ones as well, they all carry this theme of a wandering sort of loneliness present within the main characters. And while all three of these films deal with the quiet melancholy and of being an outsider, plus that motif of wandering, I noticed that they all deal with it in a different way, offering up these different lessons or outcomes, if you will. So I thought it would be interesting to explore all of that and dig deeper into all of it as well. And as for today's chat, maybe if you guys like this, I will do another episode on more of his films. So of course, I brought on a special guest to help me out. And the guest in question, it was just a no-brainer, really. I mean, we're friends, but we also connected over our mutual love for Perfect Days when it came out. He is the co-host of the ReelTok podcast, a fellow movie lover and film content creator. He also writes some of my favorite Letterboxd reviews on the app. So there you go. I am so pleased to welcome Tyler Whitmore to the pod. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, and I just realized how underprepared I am for this because I have that same Wings of Desire criterion. Don't have it in arm's reach. I had the Perfect Days T-shirt, didn't even wear it, so we're off to a rough start. I was like so prepped for this Wenders episode, and I have all these props I could have used, and don't have any of them. But yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm excited. I remember planning this. I feel like I remember planning this. We plan on doing Wings of Desire in Paris, Texas, and then Perfect Days came out like a week or two after that. I think I remember messaging you being like, we got to add this to the rundown. Like, we got to be talking about Perfect Days too, because it just blew me away, and I know it blew you away as well. So very excited to be here and talk Wim Wenders, talk these three movies. And I just wish I had my shirt on and had the criterion with me, but we'll get there.
For those of you who don't know, basically what happened was Letterboxd released, I think it was a giveaway after the release of Perfect Days, and it was a t-shirt. And I messaged Tyler being like, yo, this is only open to America. I can't enter in Canada. You need to get this shirt. You need to win, and you need to wear it for the podcast. But, next time you'll wear it for the podcast.
Yeah, next time if we do like a road trilogy episode or talk Tokyo Ga and Yasuhiro Ozu together with Wim Wenders, I'll wear it then. But yeah.
Perfect. Well, before we get into today's chat, I do have some Wenders related questions for you as well. But first of all, what have you watched recently that you can suggest to me or listeners as well?
Yeah, I picked out just a couple few because I've been watching a ton of movies, but the ones that I'll shout out is I recently watched Slacker, which is technically the second Richard Linklater film, and I loved it dearly. I love all of his films. He's one of my favorite filmmakers that's working, but it's his second film. I think on Wikipedia listed as first, but You Can't Learn to Plow by Reading Books is his debut. But Slacker, loved it. Also Bad Boys 2, I'd never seen before, and that movie was like the most fun action experience I've had in so long. And so Bad Boys 2 is such a fun time. And then I also revisited Nope and Old. So Jordan Peele's Nope and Shyamalan's Old. So two recent horror films from some of the greatest horror filmmakers working today that I liked on first watch, both of them, but didn't quite love, but I love them both on rewatch. Those are like the four I'll shout out.
Nice. I still have to watch Old. It's a movie I keep putting off because it's one of those graphs on Letterboxd that's all over the place. Like literally there are ones, there are twos, there's threes, there's fours, there's fives. So I don't know where I'm going to land, but I do like Gael Garcia Bernal. So maybe.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah. Cool. Amazing. So before I give you a breakdown into today, I'm curious how you got into Wim Wenders' work because I'm the bigger fan of Paris, Texas than you are. We're on the
Mhm.
same level as Perfect Days. And as for Wings of Desire, I'm actually unsure where you fall. So yeah, how did you get
Mhm.
into his work?
Yeah, I almost started getting into his work not by accident, but so on the ReelTok podcast, we have like viewer suggested reviews we do each week, and then we put a poll up based on our suggestions, and we'll review and do a special episode on like the highest rated poll. And about over a year now, like 15 months ago or so, Paris, Texas was the one that won that poll. So that was really my first experience with Wim Wenders in general, was watching Paris, Texas, purely because a poll of our listeners told us to watch it and review it. And my first watch of it definitely blew me away. I loved it immediately. And shortly after that, I watched Wings of Desire for the very first time on streaming. And then, like I mentioned, I got the Criterion collection of it to watch the 4K restoration. I just rewatched it like 2-ish days ago. So Paris, Texas was first, which I believe you mentioned was your first as well. And then Wings of
Hmm.
Desire jumped in for the second one. And then, late last year, I think it was December or so, Neon released Perfect Days, which immediately skyrocketed to like one of my favorites of the year. And I just rewatched it to prep for this podcast, and it's like one of my favorite films of all time, period, at this point. So those are like the three that kind of first I got into it because of a viewer recommendation, and then Wings of Desire, I feel like, is kind of the natural number two a lot of people go to. And then I've seen a couple of his noir films as well. I saw you just watched one like right before the pod, or at least you logged it right before the pod with
Yeah.
what is it, the American Friend, and then Hammett is another one I've also seen, which is produced by Francis Ford Coppola's
Oh.
production company, and it's during his stint in America, which I'm sure we'll get into, which is a few years living here. But yeah, really just kind of fell into him as a matter of destiny of a poll selecting Paris, Texas, and from there just been snowballing ever since.
I love that. That's incredible. Yeah, I enjoyed The American Friend. I don't know. I think I like his stuff more when he gets more philosophical, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
than when he's doing more so noir stuff.
Yeah, I agree. I would pause with recommending Hammett then too, which I like less than the American
Mm,
Friend, but the American Friend is more neo noir, and Hammett's like is
mm,
tried and true pure noir as it gets. And I think Wenders is more interesting when he's doing his more road genre type movies. But it's interesting, and it's interesting to pair with his just career in general, because like this is when he's in America and he's making these noir films. He's pairing up with Coppola and all these other actors like Jack Nance and people that are in like David Lynch films. So it's interesting to pair the movies he made while he's in America with his career. But in terms of like through a narrow scope of just watching the movie for what it was, they're fine. They're nothing bad, but nothing,
hmm.
like the three we're going to talk about today.
For sure. So, perfect segue, actually. Let me explain what we're doing today. We're going to start with a bit of a background into Wenders' work, his style, associations people make with his work, and then we'll get into all three films in the order that they came out. So, Paris, Texas, which came out in 1984, Wings of Desire in 87, and then we take a huge leap into the future with Perfect Days from 2023. And throughout, of course, we'll chat about the central theme of the wandering melancholy protagonist. How does that sound?
Perfect.
Perfect. So, Wim Wenders, he was born on August 14th, 1945, in Dusseldorf, in Germany. And he's considered a major part of the new German cinema movement. Tyler, how familiar are you with the new German cinema movement?
Just in my preparation for this podcast, looking into the new German cinema movement, but definitely of the filmmakers most prominently featured. So you have like the Fassbinders and Herzogs. Wenders is the one I've seen the most films from, but this from the 60s to 80s. Historically, just if you think about Germany and that time in general, with like the history that's going on, just cinema completely removed. Obviously, a massive time of transformation and identity and change, trying to capture what their culture and identity is going to be going forward after the mid 1900s, where the entire world was at war with each other. And Wenders and it's a collection of probably like 20 other directors. So I feel bad for not shouting them all out. But yeah, part of this new German cinema movement that I'm sure you have more information on than I do.
I mean, that was a perfect little introduction. I'm very impressed. But yeah, you're right. There was Wenders. I'm mostly familiar with Herzog, of course, and Fassbinder. There's also Marguerite von Trott, and like you said, there's so many others. But the movement came to be from something called the Oberhausen Manifesto. And this was a declaration that was made by a group of 26 young German filmmakers in 1962, I think it was. And they were kind of the forerunners of this movement that then later started in that same decade. And they created this document that recognized the need for a fresh type of filmmaking, kind of as you were saying as well. And as they wrote in the manifesto, the collapse of the commercial German film industry got rid of this economic need to make these old sorts of movies that this new group essentially rejected. And so they saw this as an opportunity to usher in a new type of filmmaking. And so the budget, or the movement itself, consisted of low budgets. It was also influenced by French New Wave, Italian neorealism as well. And the whole point of it was to create movies that had more artistic value. So basically what these other countries were doing too. And that's what they championed, not big budgets. There wasn't any economic need for what was going to be commercially successful. And so while all these different filmmakers from the movement developed their own unique styles, so did Wenders, right? His films were, or are, particularly at the start of that movement, more quiet. They were more melancholy, I would say. They just really knew how to get sympathy from the viewer. And so he explores social alienation. He'd also explore post-war German angst and the feelings around that. And he also then explored American culture when he went to America too, and so on and so forth. But does that kind of explain things a bit better?
I think for me, it definitely covers that. I think the big theme that you were nailing, that I was seeing when I was researching, is just the low budget. Like, to just further emphasize that, it means like the absolute shoestrings, like any dollar that could be spared is going to be spared. Mm-hmm. These were just completely different than anything that they were producing in Germany before this, just stripping away all sorts of budgets, going way more art house, and just a real shift from what you were seeing earlier before then.
Totally. Yeah. So back to Wenders as well. So with him, a huge part of his youth was an interest in American pop culture. And most importantly, rock and roll, which we see plays a massive role in his films. Amazing soundtracks he always has. And what's interesting is he initially didn't want to be a filmmaker. Do you know where I'm going with this?
Kind of. You might know. What, didn't he initially want to be a painter?
Exactly. That's exactly it. So he wanted to be a painter. And of course, he still has that love for visual art. He's a respected photographer to this day as well. And paintings influence his work greatly, which is why you always see these gorgeous landscape shots in his films. And with his work as a painter, he said that his interest the most was space. And I don't mean like space up above. I mean like landscapes and cities, spaces, right? Mm-hmm. And he said that it hit him to become a filmmaker when he realized that paintings lack the notion of time. So the missing element was a concrete type of storytelling, which then inspired his film career. And as such, he basically said that his stories start from images, and his stories always begin with places and cities and landscapes and roads. And that's something you can definitely pick up on, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I mean, Paris, Texas alone, just in the name of the movie itself. But yeah, it's just so fascinating that you come from that painting background, which when you think about sculpting an image, like there's so much similarities and overlap there. And he actually failed. I don't know if you're gonna mention this, but he like failed his entrance exam to get into film school, and then from there he just worked as an engraver to save up money and watched. He set up to like 5 movies a day at his local movie theater, which I think a lot of people listening, you know, we can be empathize. Like if you're very passionate about trying to make movies or get deeper into cinema, like, you know, just watching as much as you can, like that's kind of Wenders' track. Like he failed getting into film school and just decided to absorb as much content as he can, watch as much movies as he can, and, you know, obviously look where that got him.
Exactly. Yeah. So finally, he made his directorial feature film debut with, what is it called? Summer in the City in 1970. And that was actually his graduation project when he finally got to the University of Television and TV in Munich. And even with this, so early on, there were those trademark themes of a wandering aimlessness and so on and so forth. And from there, he then did The Goalie's Anxiety at the Penalty Kick, which is actually a really good early movie of his. If you haven't seen it, I would definitely check it out, from 1972. And this was adapted from a Peter Handke short novel from 1970. And the reason I mentioned Peter Handke is because he went on to work with him again, and we'll cover that. And then from 1974 to 1976, he did his road movie trilogy. So Alice in the Cities, The Wrong Move, and Kings of the Road. Then in 1977, he really gained traction for The American Friend, which we both recently watched. And as you said, that's a neo-noir starring Dennis Hopper and Bruno Ganz. And Bruno we later see again in Wings of Desire, which, by the way, totally different characters. I was like, when I was watching it last night, I was like, whoa, this guy has range. But yeah, I'll stop there background-wise because we could be chatting about his filmography forever. But is there anything you want to add before we get into his stylistic elements?
Just, I guess, the movies we covered up till now, kind of off topic, but the Road Trilogy Criterion is kind of like, there's a Criterion sale going on right now, and that's kind of like my number one, like that's what I want to get next, add to the collection. I also want to get Tokyo Ga. I was about to watch that last night on the Criterion channel, but But yeah, no, I think you've kind of been nailing it so far.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, we've been doing it together. But by the way, side note, yeah, I know that sale is going on. It's the Barnes& and Noble one. Do you know
Hmm.
that we actually can't ship anything from Barnes& and Noble in the US to Canada? It's
Really.
like the saddest thing. Yeah, I tried this morning and it was just like, oh, it's
Mm.
not going to work. So anyway, that's my gripe. But yeah, okay. So I'm so stoked for this little section on, I guess, style and thematic elements.
Mhm.
First of all, visually, a lot of urban streets or highways are present in Wenders' films. Again, we said that these narratives also feature folks who are displaced or they're wanderers or they're just kind of living these transient lifestyles. And Wenders once told the New Republic in an interview that his early films are ones about alienation. And he said that his characters slowly learned to form relationships because he was slowly learning to relate to people. And this quote obviously came out well before he did Perfect Days, but I wanted to highlight it because Perfect Days is his first major success in years. And perhaps it's because he goes back to that motif of learning to relate to people and form these bonds. What do you think?
I have a lot of thoughts on Perfect Days and how he attacked that movie, but I'll kind of save that for that section later. But no, it
Hmm.
definitely, you see really most of 2000s he fell out of favor for the most part, and then 2023 kind of comes back with a vengeance, where he goes back to these themes of identity and appreciation for identity and really looking at people's purpose and recovering that identity. And there's such quiet, typical slow cinema like you see from him. And, I haven't seen a ton of his films or I haven't seen really anything from like 2000 through like Perfect Days, really. Nothing in the Perfect Days is the only 2000s film I've seen from him. But, if you look at just general reviews of his movies from those times, like you said, that's his first kind of home run that he's had in decades, and I think a lot of it has to do with reconnecting with those themes that made him so popular when he initially kind of took the stage with the Road trilogy going into the American Friend, and then of course the back-to-back Paris, Texas, and Wings of Desire.
Yeah, I'm happy you also brought up that theme of identity because that's a big one as well. Also, just loss, time, memories, nostalgia. And I think that this motif of having lead characters who wander and who are kind of directionless, let's call it, I think that that's very visibly seen in all the movies that we'll chat about today. You have
Mhm.
Travis in Paris, Texas, who starts the movie drifting without purpose or memory, really. Then you have Damiel in Wings of Desire, who also has that complicated existence as an angel without really any other purpose besides recording what happens to humans and I guess maybe sometimes guiding them, but he's also restless and kind of in between two worlds, basically. And then you have Hirayama in Perfect Days, who's also quite isolated. I mean, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's interesting because you see, the characters within Wings of Desire are they're angels looking for. We mainly see it with is it Damiel? Is that's the character that's transient,
Bruno
right? That
Ganz. Yeah.
yes, you see him not really he's griping with his identity and his purpose, and mostly, like you said, they're not really like influencing what people do for the most part. I mean, you do see some of those moments, but
Hmm.
mostly they're just observing and trying to grapple with these other people that are, in Paris, Texas. You see these wide open landscapes where there's tons of vast expanses, like you mentioned at the very opening. Whereas Wings of Desire, you're like in this crowded city, but these people are still so isolated and have these own thoughts of feeling like they're not fitting in with society and have their own wandering issues that they're going on through with their life and trying to combat. And then Perfect Days, you have, again, you're in Tokyo, a very populated city and a populated country, and he's just going on to the mundane of his life. So I think the three movies we're kind of covering today, and what Wenders is like so good at doing in general, is whether you're in a wandering through an open desert or you're in the middle of one of the most populated cities in the world, you can still have that gripe of trying to figure out what your identity is, feeling isolated, feeling alone, trying to find out your new identity, reinvent yourself, whether you're walking through a desert or whether you're working in the middle of Tokyo.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I would also add that their wandering is a result of their pasts, particularly with Paris, Texas and Perfect
Mhm.
Days. There's also that sort of motif of a domestic bliss that they're after, but I guess this time more so with Paris, Texas and Wings of Desire. But above all, there's always just that uncertainty with how these stories will be resolved. It's more so about the journey itself than the resolution, right?
Mhm. Yep,
Yeah,
definitely.
I would say so, yeah. But yeah, I guess let's get into the three movies we have today. This is perfect time. So Paris, Texas from 1984, probably his most well-known movie, as we were saying. It won the Palme d'Or at Cannes the year it came out. And the film introduces us to Travis, played by the late, great Harry Dean Stanton, whom I adore. We first see him wandering the desert in Texas. He looks disheveled, confused. He's at the brink of collapse, really. And when he finally does collapse right outside of a small town, we discover that Travis is, for now, mute. And without giving away a massive breakdown of what happens, his brother, Walt, comes to get him. They eventually get to Burbank in California, where Walt lives with his French wife, Anne, and Travis's son, Hunter, who is 7. And Travis hasn't seen any of them in over 4 years, it is, right? I think.
I believe so. It's
Yeah,
been a long time, and they basically thought he was dead. So enough time to
exactly.
where you wouldn't know where they are.
Exactly. And Hunter, of course, if he's 7 and if he hasn't seen him in that long, he doesn't really know his father. So they slowly bond. And as Travis regains his abilities of speech back, and through some information that we learn, he decides to go to Houston to find Hunter's mother, Jane, played by Nastasia Kinski. And Hunter goes with him without the approval of Walt and Anne. I guess I'll stop there plot wise. Is there anything you want to add to the plot, Tyler?
I just think it's so before they embark on that road trip to go back from California back to Texas, you see Travis staying with his brother Walt and his wife and in California. You can see how uncomfortable that makes him. And that's just part of the theme we'll kind of dive into more of, just figuring out reclaiming your identity and the wanderer and feeling like you don't belong, because you see, I mean, he tries to run away. He eventually takes, his son and to go and find his son's eventual mother, and tries to right that wrong from his past has been gnawing away at him, and trying to right this final wrong. But I just thought it was fascinating how everything up to that road trip, you see how uncomfortable in his own skin he was being in California, being under the care and supervision of his brother and his wife, and how unnatural it was for him, and how he just was kind of doing anything he could, Travis was, to get out of that environment, just kind of accomplish the task he set out to do, and kind of get back to where he was before.
Also, the shoe polishing. I remember when I watched that for the first time, I was like, what is going on?
Yep.
So strange. I guess we should also mention as well that although the film is named after Paris in Texas, there aren't any scenes actually there. We only see Paris, Texas in the form of a photograph, which is where Travis thinks he was conceived, where he bought that vacant lot that he was going to use for his domestic bliss that he once thought he could have. But I'm curious, do you see that lot or Paris, Texas itself as another metaphor?
Absolutely. I think the genius of the film of Paris, Texas starts with the title of the film. I mean, and you hear it throughout the film with the tales that he's told of his mother being Parisian, but that Paris being Texas as opposed to Paris, France. I lived in Dallas suburbs for 3.5 years, and I was 90 minutes away from the city of Paris, Texas. So I could theoretically any day get in my car and drive there. I never did. Like, it's not a city people go to like experience. Like, there's a couple boutique shops, but it's not a place people visit or whatsoever. It's a very desolate town. Whereas Paris, France is, top 5 bucket list for most people to visit in their lifetime. So you couldn't really have 2 more different cities in Paris, France and Paris, Texas. And that's why I think just the name of the film being Paris, Texas, and that just juxtaposition of a city where Paris, you think of the pinnacle of France, pinnacle of Europe, and these beautiful touristy destinations and lavish lifestyles and just dream tourism destinations. And then you have Texas where, they have major cities in Texas, which we do see a lot in Houston. This film takes place in Houston, but a lot of Texas, just vast desert, vast open and nothingness. And yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head there. And I think Paris, Texas, in the name of the film is just really just where the genius of this film starts.
Yeah, I'm really happy that you brought that up. I actually wasn't going to talk about that juxtaposition, but I'm glad you covered it. Also, so very jealous that you lived close to Paris, Texas. I mean,
I've
I
never
don't know.
been. So
I feel like as a film fan, I would have just wanted to go just to say that I've gone. But yeah, you're right. I'm sure it would have just been like a quick trip just to take a photo and keep going. But anyway, I also do want to mention how important language and communication are to this movie, because that was one thing, especially during this rewatch, what I really, really noticed. And the start of Paris, Texas is very telling to Travis's mental state, which becomes even more apparent, like I said, on rewatch, or I think so at least. But it opens with him in a desert, right? With nothing around him to guide him, no signs, literally nothing but desert. And the only companion he has, so to speak, is that falcon that watches him, almost like a vulture, like waiting for him to drop dead, to put it bluntly. But it's a symbol of decay, right? And as Travis wanders aimlessly, that represents that numb sort of isolation that he has due to his past. The desert represents his state that can't be fixed until he addresses his trauma and everything that's led to this. And so, where am I going with this? The first words he speaks after almost half an hour in the film or that's when he speaks the first words after half an hour in the film. So the closer Travis gets to civilization as the film progresses, the closer he gets to being able to communicate. Am I making
Mhm.
sense?
You are, and that's an interesting note I didn't really pick up on because he's mute for a large majority of that first act of the film, and his brother's begging him to just say something or
Hmm.
speak. And we see, I believe I'm not mistaken, he tears up at the name of his son, but that's before we've ever heard him speak. So like you see, not only is he starting to talk more, he's getting close to civilization. It feels like his emotions are coming back in general.
Exactly. And I'm happy that you bring up Walt because that's obviously the first sort of trigger for him to speak, right? And he has these guides that help him speak. And Walt is kind of that first guide. And I mean, even pay attention to Walt's job. He makes signs, billboards, right? So which in of themselves is communicating to people that can
Mm-hmm.
see these signs. So he's the first person to help Travis as it's through his, as you said, repeated probing that he gifts Travis the gift of language again, basically. And then after that, we have Travis's son. And one also interesting thing to note is children in themselves are a recurring motif in Wenders' films. Wings of Desire as well, that the children can see the angels. We have Alice in the Cities and so on and so forth. But they essentially function for adult characters to open up to the possibilities of change and save these adults, where that's how I see them. And so with Hunter in Paris, Texas, Travis initially is the one who seems childlike. He's, traumatized and made mute by his past experiences. And it's only after he meets his son that his son takes on a bit more of a fatherly role for a little bit that changes Travis's perceptions and guides him to take action. Anything else you want to add here? Mention any other guides, I guess, let's call it, of Travis's?
No, I mean the son's a great one because when they're in Houston and trying to find initially before they find his mother at the peep show, when it's him and his son driving around the city trying to wait outside the bank trying to catch her, like his son Hunter's driving that whole thing. Like Travis is kind of just sitting in his car, he even dozes off, and they both have the goal of finding this woman, but like Hunter's the one that's like scoping out the premises, talking on the walkie-talkie, and like Travis is kind of almost a follower at that point too. So Hunter definitely has a son, being what, like 30 to 40 years younger than what Travis would be,
Mm-hmm.
is that the more astute, apt, and well adjusted to society and accomplishing their goal, it seems, for the majority of their road trip.
Absolutely. Oh, there's also, it just came to me, Jane, with a theme of language and as a way to problem solve this loneliness as a means of mediation. If you think
Mm-hmm.
about it, it's language that connects him to Jane, not touch,
Mm-hmm.
since they're separated by glass, quite literally, when they finally do see
Mm-hmm.
each other. And
Mm-hmm.
so later on with Hunter as well, Travis records a tape for him, which I guess is spoiler alert, but if you're listening to this, things have been spoiled. But he records a tape for him as a goodbye. So again, there's no touch there. There's always language. So you have, yeah, language throughout this entire film. And I would argue that throughout Travis's journey, he discovers more about himself and those around him through communicating in language, not touch, not nothing physical. And this understanding ultimately leads him to the only option he has left, which is a fresh start. Or yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, yeah, like you mentioned, they never touch. Him and Jane don't touch ever. They're separated by glass when they have that final, that third act is mostly just their conversation at that peep show, which is just, perfection, 5 out of 5, dynamite. Like that final act is just the definition of a perfect cinema, in my opinion. And they never touch. Most of the time, Travis can always see her. She can barely see him because it's obviously
Mm-hmm.
like a peep show and she's working there and they don't let them see the clientele. It's, they're more putting on a show where the person who's kind of going and being a patron like Travis is there to, observe them, talk to them. And again, you can tell he's talking way more than she's used to or anyone who's working there is used to. They're used to kind of, more doing what they're intended to do in that business. And not until I think he like turns off the lights or tells her to turn off the lights, then she can like barely see a faint look at his face. But I mean, even then it's very obscure, very dark, very hard to see. So, I mean, not only do they not touch, but it's really kind of mostly a one-way looking relationship. And I mean, obviously he even turns away from the glass for the majority of the conversation. So beyond just touch, it's not even really visible cues either. It's really just purely the dialogue is what's
Mm-hmm.
reconnecting them and accomplishing this final goal of reconnecting Hunter with his mother, Jane.
Mm-hmm. And so he sees her twice, right? The first time he's
Mm-hmm.
too overwhelmed with emotions and he leaves and he comes back, I think it's the next day. And when he finally does reveal the past to her, we discover that they were once together. And they almost had this domestic ideal, as we were saying, but he ruined it. Travis was abusive. Some of the things he did were horrifying. And this is all due to his alcoholism and jealousy. And it's even acknowledged that Jane is much younger than him. And it's something that Travis acknowledges himself. And this led to his jealousy and insecurities, I would even say. But what's interesting is we never know if Jane wasn't loyal to Travis. It's just, again, something that was in his mind, this obsession that grew and that led to their downfall and her escape. So after all of that, after losing his old life, that's when he became this wandering mute lead, totally removed from everything. And so, what is his journey in Paris, Texas? It's to reconcile his past and move on. I have my own theory, but why do you think he ultimately leaves Jane and Hunter?
I think so. You mentioned Travis is a grade A self-sabotager, and that's what he did throughout their relationship when him and Jane were together. And ultimately, like you said, like, was she unfaithful to him or not? We never really get a clear picture, but in his mind, she thought either she was cheating or she was going to cheat. And he just had this figment in his mind that she's too good for him. So he's going to just do anything in his own power through alcoholism, through abuse, through just being mentally vacant to self-sabotage relationship. And then after, these 4-ish years, I think we kind of agreed on that being the time frame. I don't know the exact number, but 4-ish years or so apart, ultimately his son thinks he's dead, his brother thinks he's dead, and he resurfaces and he goes on this mission to reconnect his son Hunter with his mother Jane, and then ultimately leaves them. Like they never see each other in person other than with a glass facing or between them. They never touch, and he just kind of leaves her there and then goes off. And we don't really know exactly where he heads to and what his journey is after that, but really just ends there by reconnecting the son and mother. And it is such an interesting thing to interpret, because both times I watched, I feel so much empathy and worry for Hunter, because it's been years that they've been disconnected, and Travis is still seems like he's just going to kind of go wander away and not really be a part of his life again. And Jane hasn't been a mother for really ever of Hunter's life, it seems like, or maybe a couple of years. So where does that lead? And I think it's just Travis is just so set on this idea of reconciling with his past that he just sees it as connecting the dots of get Hunter to Jane, and he can in his soul just say, okay, I'm done with this mission, done with this part of my life, and this chapter's closed. I feel fulfilled with that and can move on. But it's there's no real knowing of if it's the right thing for the family or right thing for is this going to be a net positive, or it's more for his own soul's fulfillment. Whereas, maybe Hunter might be better off if he just grew up with, Walt and his wife Anne instead of going with the mom. It's a tough thing that you can't really know how it pans out unless you can view alternate universes of where Paris, Texas leads in 20 years after the film ends. If it's, whether he completes his journey and brings Hunter all the way to Jane and leaves him there in that hotel room together to, you'd imagine live together and flourish, and she raises him, versus if he never would have gotten found by his brother and would have just let it be. It's tough, and it's hard to know exactly where it would go, but I'm curious to know what your kind of interpretation of what you think happens, or what he makes that final decision and where it kind of goes from there.
So mine is, I agree with you. Mine's very, very similar to yours. And I think with Travis, he comes to understand that he was the catalyst for so much pain. And Jane even tells him she heard his voice in whichever man she spoke to, or something like that. So perhaps he understands that he's a symbol of this domestic violence. And instead of staying and perhaps allowing that cycle to repeat itself, he starts a new beginning instead. And there's an interesting moment that occurs as he's walking through LA. I think this is the moment where it starts to click for him that he's a catalyst for all of this. He's walking through LA after Anne tells him about the bank in Houston, and he already looks less distressed and lost than he did at the start of the film. And as he's walking, he hears that man on the street shouting prophecies about doomsday or whatever it was. I think he says something like, what does he say? You'll all be extradited to the land of no return. And what Travis does next is he puts his hand on the man's shoulder or back very briefly, and then he walks away. And that to me is a very, very significant moment where Travis essentially sees that this man that's screaming and yelling could have been him had he not started this quest of confronting his past. So that action of putting his hand on the man is one of recognition and awareness, and ultimately acceptance. What do you think? Are there any other moments like that that stood out to you?
No, I think that's a really key moment of the film that completely just went over my head in terms of this conversation, that I think is very integral. And I was mentioning, what is the right decision for the family unit? Is it to reconnect the mother and father? Is it for him to stay with his brother and aunt? But regardless, what Travis knows, whether he goes on this journey or not, is that Travis can't be involved in the kid's
Mhm.
life or, his ex-wife's life and Jane, because he knows that just because now he has this kind of purpose and to accomplish his mission, he doesn't trust in his own self to not mess it up again, self-sabotage again, be a bad husband, be a bad father, be a bad brother. So regardless of his ultimate motivations or ultimate decision making, if that's like, a good decision or bad decision objectively in terms of for the futures of everyone else involved other than Travis, he knows regardless of the decision he makes and going on the journey or not, that he's not staying. He can't stay because he's not. I mean, as you can tell from watching the movie, he's not there yet to be able to be a stable father, to be able to be a stable partner relationship. He has a lot of own workings out to do with his own mental and emotional state, and still has a lot of his own identity, even though he kind of unravels and you discover more along the way with this road movie. There's still a lot of work to do, and he knows that he can't really be around to have that work done while his family is, trying to live on their own lives and, keep doing well on their own without him and being involved.
Absolutely. I think he even says at one point, I can't remember if it's early in the film or in the middle portion, but he says something like, I had no idea I had so much anger inside of me. And that's
Mhm.
exactly that what you're saying, just the fact that he needs to solve that. And so he leaves everybody behind. And that also kind of speaks to what we're talking today, the nature of the leading protagonist Wander. He leaves
Mhm.
everybody behind, Walt and Jane, Hunter, and so on. He's just passing through transient. And yeah, I guess that's kind of it for me with Paris, Texas, unless you want to add more.
Mhm. Yeah, I think just in general with Wenders films, with these films of road genres in general, which can vary widely in terms of what they all overall come across as. I mean, like, Paris, Texas is a road movie. I mean, some people would call it a Western, but it's definitely at least both, but it's a road movie. But then also like Mad Max are road movies, but obviously very different, but a lot of similarities you can draw from them as well. And I think with Wenders films, it's just a matter of like when they hit you, like sometimes it can just hit you like a ton of bricks, or sometimes it might not hit as hard. And I think the second time I watched it, it was just like a different part of my life where like it didn't quite connect. But regardless, like when I'm talking, I dropped it from a 4.5 on Letterboxd to a 4. So we're like splitting hairs at this point, because regardless, they're phenomenal films. But I think the extra element of making it like an all-timer connection for you, because I know plenty of mutual friends of mine who just, this film isn't really for them. And I think it's just a matter of being at a point in your life, maybe you're feeling a little lost in your own respects and trying to figure out your kind of next steps, and you having a little bit of an identity crisis or at a pivotal moment of change in your life. And I think Wenders films, if you're at the right moment for that, almost have caution watching them, because it might, like at Perfect Days for me, that's the movie for me where it's like, ooh, it's almost like putting too much of a mirror in front of your own face. You're like, man, this is making me need to address some issues in my own life. And I think Paris, Texas, that's why so many people can connect with this, because, and just in terms of themes of Wenders films in general, with the themes of the wander and trying to find your own identity and reconnection and re-identify yourself, can be so impactful for so many people.
Yeah, wow, that was perfectly put, Tyler. I love that little wrap up of Paris, Texas. I completely agree with you. I think one reason why some people will watch, especially like our generation, this younger generation, when they watch Paris, Texas for the first time, I think because they've seen so many stills of it, they think it's going to be a quicker film. And it's actually such a slow burn of a movie that I think that's
Mm,
also maybe why some people won't jive with it, let's say, unless you are really going through some stuff.
for sure.
But anyway, let's get to Wings of Desire next. So, 1987, this was his next film after Paris, Texas, or I guess technically no, because he did the Ozu documentary, Tokyo
Mm,
Ga, in 1985. But in terms of fiction, this was next. And this was Wenders' return to Europe and Germany, specifically after spending 8 years in the US. And it's interesting because Wenders said that after 8 years in America, he finally realized and accepted that he is a European filmmaker. And up until Wings of Desire, his movies set in Germany were about people wanting to leave Germany. So he wanted to make a film that looks at Germany while still taking the viewpoint of an outsider. And in this case, he makes that Angels. And Wenders told BFI that he made a conscious decision to make Wings of Desire more dialogue heavy than Paris, Texas, because although Paris, Texas gave him a lot of good in his life, of course, it also left him with an expectation to do something like that again. And he didn't want to do that. So he viewed Paris, Texas as like a goodbye film to America. Before we get into the plot of Wings of Desire, how did you've seen this twice now, right?
mm-hmm.
Did
Yep.
it go up for you on rewatch or down?
They were there. It was 4.5 both times for me. I
Mm.
would say, I guess I might have liked Paris, Texas more at the time when I first watched both of them, but I think now I'd say I like Wings of Desire more. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I forgot to mention that at the end of Paris, Texas, but I think it's a perfect segue where he kind of says, you know, he says the end of Paris, Texas felt like a liberating moment for him because it kind of closed the chapter on not only living in America, but he also said that all of his previous male characters in every film, like even before he came to America, he says they kind of just, their story ended there. And he said, even in a quote, they've all taken up a residence in a retirement home in the outskirts of Paris, Texas. So really Wings of Desire is like a massive shift in terms of like, he felt like he kind of closed a chapter of his life and chapter of his filmography and moves on going forward now, viewing, you know, Germany through this outsider's perspective, which I haven't seen Tokyo Guy yet, but just reading the synopsis of that documentary, it's a lot of based on, you know, growing up watching and being a huge fan of Yoshihiro Ozu and then going to Japan himself. And he found that it was not exactly what he was expecting it would be based on the films of Ozu. And I think that kind of perfectly is a transition from Paris, Texas to what this is now, because that's the only thing in between them, where now he takes that same kind of juxtaposition of having an idea of what something is like or a city is like or a place is like in his mind, and then realizing it's a little different or having a different perspective on it. And then he kind of turns that back on where he's from in Germany with Wings of Desire and having this outsider perspective of the angels.
Exactly. And I mean, personally, I adore this movie. I really do. I think it's my favorite by Wenders. Perfect Days is a close second. But the reason why I love this one so much is because I just think it perfectly captures the essence of being human. It's just so reflective. It's so melancholy. It's also just a wise film, I think. So let's just describe it, I guess. So Wings of Desire introduces us to two angels, as we said, in Berlin. It's also worthwhile noting that the film was released 2 years before the fall of the Berlin Wall. Again, we'll get into that a bit, I'm sure. But anyway, we meet Damiel, who is our central lead, played by Bruno Ganz, and Cassiel, played by Otto Sander. Side note, did you know these two are super close friends in real life?
I did when I was researching this, and he purposely wanted to do that because he wanted the rapport to feel so natural, magnetic, and just the chemistry to overflow on the screen between these two characters in the film. So he picked two actors that have had, you know, long history working together.
Exactly, because they've been together for like since the dawn of time in the movie, basically. So it's a lot of time to spend together.
Right.
So these two guys act like guardian angels and they float through Berlin, literally float through that wall itself, and they listen to the thoughts of people and try to offer comfort sometimes. Most of the time, they just observe, as we were saying at the start of the episode, and then they get together and discuss their findings for each individual day. I would say that Cassiel is more stern of the two, very rigid with his job, while Damiel desires to become human and experience humanity fully. And this all happens after he falls in love with a trapeze artist, Marion, played by Solveig Don Martin, who was actually Wenders' girlfriend at the time. I don't know if you must have read that as well.
I actually didn't catch that.
Oh, no. Yeah. Yeah, she was. So, spoilers here as well. We also meet Peter Falk in the role of Peter Falk. And we later discover that he was once an angel himself, but he wanted to become human. And so he's now an actor. There's a great joke within the movie where someone sees him on the street and says, "Isn't that Columbo?" Which is quite literally Falk's famous role. But plot-wise, am I missing anything? No, I don't think.
I don't think so. I think you've nailed it up this point.
That's okay, good. But yeah, I just side note, I love Peter Falk in this. I think just being in the movie, playing himself, the fact that he's in Berlin to shoot a film, so we get a movie within a movie, and just the scene with him specifically at the coffee stand where he knows that Damiel is there, but he can't see him, so he starts talking about these like simple pleasures of life. I just think that it's kind of similar actually to Perfect Days thematically, where he lists off all these things that he loves about life, like the coldness of the winter. But if you rub your hands together, you feel the heat, or having a coffee or a cigarette, but it's better if you have it with somebody else. I just love that scene. That's such a standout for me.
Peter Falk is really like he's like really the catalyst to this movie, because, you know, we see Damiel the whole film is, because you mentioned, you know, Cassiel's kind of the more just, you know, by the book angel. He's just going to kind of do his angel duties, whereas Damiel starts to have this, you know, internal battle of, you know, does he want to keep doing this, or does he want to be a human? Like, what is the purpose of like all the purpose of life in general? Because one thing you also touched on is like that these characters have been together forever, like literally forever. Like they were in this area of Berlin before Berlin was a thing, before Germany was a thing. Just they've been there forever, and he's starting to wonder his purpose and the purpose of what they're doing, him and Castiel, every day with observing these people reporting out. I love the conversation when they're kind of in that park and they're just in their car with each other and just kind of giving a report out on the day of all these
Yes.
people that they observed and witnessed. But then you have the Peter Falk character who used to be in their shoes and now is an actor and filmmaker and making these movies in Germany. And he's observing him, but then Daniel's really starting to get that allure. And Peter Falk kind of, like you said, eggs him on a bit by knowing he's there and kind of purposely tempts him by saying, like, this is all the great stuff there is about humanity, stuff you would never be able to understand or feel as an angel. Like, it's just literally impossible to try and get him to make that crossover. And that's really kind of the crux of a large part of the movie, is this just existential crisis that Damien's having with, does he stay doing his task and his job, or does he make the crossover and experience humanity, really?
Exactly. And I also want to quickly just run back to what you were saying when we first started chatting about Wings of Desire. And that's how Wenders has said that this film was like a homecoming for him to come back to
Mm-hmm.
Germany. And he said he wanted to rediscover Germany, including Berlin, of course. And it's his favorite city. And at the time, he was reading poetry by Rainer Rilke, which included this recurring motif of angels. And as Wenders walked through Berlin when he came back, he was just struck by this like angelic symbolism everywhere in sculptures and everywhere around him. And so he approached Peter Hanke for a script. Remember, I mentioned him at the start, I believe I did. And yeah, so Hanke was all written out at that point. He had just finished a bunch of projects and he wanted a break. But after sitting on the concept for a few days, he told Wenders to just start shooting without a script.
Mm-hmm.
And daily he would send him monologues or dialogue to incorporate, which I find so fascinating, don't you?
Yeah, and wasn't, I believe I'm not mistaken, so much of the actual audio you hear in the film of the actual speaking was voiceovers long after the fact. That a lot of, like as you mentioned, they did a lot of this without having most of this film even written, and a lot of it was just filmed, and then later and after the fact is when they added in most of the dialogue that was actually written for the movie.
Exactly. And I think honestly, all of this speaks to how human these interactions feel as you're listening to them. I don't know, they just feel like they were done on the fly or after, or I don't know, it's very unique. And
Mm-hmm.
so to speak to that motif we're discussing, the theme of loneliness and wandering, what helped me make sense of this quite a bit was an admission by Wenders himself. He said that everything he'd done thus far was shot in multiple locations, or I guess on the road, if you will, horizontally
Mm-hmm.
moving. So he referred to Wings of Desire as a vertical road movie. And initially I was like, what the hell does that mean? And then I realized vertical, it denotes the presence of angels above and humans at the bottom, and they're on these separate journeys. Or that's how I interpret it. What do you make of that vertical road movie?
No, I mean, of course it makes sense because you have this which I believe is on the cover of the Criterion, maybe on the cover in general. You obviously have this angel that's overlooking the city in general, high up
Oh, yeah.
above where these angels sit, or mostly we see Damiel kind of sitting up there observing the city. But yeah, the kind of vertical, as opposed to these road movies where they're spanning, in the America one with Perfect or Paris, Texas, we just talked about going from California to Texas. That's, very, very long road trip. That's like 20 plus hours of just driving. So obviously, and the landscapes could be more different with like downtown Los Angeles and the deserts of Texas. So you kind of get all these different landscapes and you get all different kinds of cultures and perspectives. Whereas in this movie, you see, in a sense, Berlin is a little bit two-ish cities at the time. You have West and East Berlin, and this is before the fall of the Berlin Wall, but it's one city at the end of the day. And we really see it from the perspective of all these different people within this one city, and, from the perspective of the people on the ground or people that are angels overlooking it. So that is interesting. I never heard that term before, of going from like a horizontal, view and viewscape of trying to make a film versus a vertical now. But I mean, when you think of Wings of Desire, it just totally makes sense to describe it that way.
Hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Like you said, it's layered because, as you literally just mentioned, we hear these different layers of people and their struggles, and because the movie is layered, when it explores that theme of loneliness, I think that's what makes it so effective. Because we obviously have the humans who the angels listen to, and we hear their woes and their troubles, and some of these people are incredibly damaged, as we find out as well. But then we also have
Mm-hmm.
Damiel himself, who yearns to be human, so he can experience love. So again harks back to that motif in Benders's movies of the lonely soul searching for just stability, or I guess even for him in this movie, he's searching for like a domestic ideal kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't want to be an angel stuck in eternity of just being passive. because yeah, we also learned that they've been there forever. So of course he wants something that's more, tangible than just floating until the dawn of time, until the end of time. And that divide between the angels and the humans, that only furthers how isolated these angels are, I think. Don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, and just the people in general, the angels are observing being so lonely as you were mentioning, and some of them very damaged. And that's why I think kind of contrasting this with Paris, Texas, where in Berlin, a very popular, like you get these panning images of apartment buildings that are multi-floored, and you have, maybe hundreds of people live in the same building, but you kind of zoom in on one window of one person who's feels so lonely and alone and feels like there's no one in this world for them. And I mean, even with the trapeze artist who has a lot of emotional struggles she's going with, and it's just kind of great musings on the fact that you can live, and people always say it about like New York City in general too, like you can live in an area where you're encountering hundreds of thousands of people every single day, but you can still feel just so lonely and so trapped inside your own mind and unsure of your purpose in this world. And we see that with Damiel as well. Like, what's his purpose in general too, because we kind of keep talking about how they're angels overseeing, and sometimes they intervene, but most of the time we see them, they're observing what people are thinking, what people are doing, and just reporting out. And I think that's why another kind of theme I take away from this movie is just the importance of art and history and cinema. I mean, we talked about the beginning of the background of Wenders and his career in the new German cinema movement, of being a time of immense change for Germany. And this film obviously coming out right when the Berlin Wall is about to be falling. And they're looking for their own identity in terms of Germany as well, and trying to foster that into the new age of cinema and art, and just remembering their history, but also trying to redefine who they are. And I just think that's a lot of what is happening here. Is, I mean, we like outspokenly see it through Peter Falk's character, who is a filmmaker and actor, and making these films about, the Nazi past and the city. Whereas, then you have Damiel, who's kind of observing all this stuff and documenting it, but not really ever making it tangible for anyone to see or feel. And he's kind of deciding, like, do I want to be human and live these experiences and actually feel this for myself? So I don't know. I got a lot from, and further researching it as well, just got a lot of themes of just the importance of cinema in general, of being able to document things and provide experiences for people that they would never be able to experience on their own, by capturing these stories and capturing these places and making them accessible to everyone who might not otherwise be able to experience it for themselves, which, Damiel ends up able to experience things for himself at the end, becomes human and experiences, the taste of coffee and the touch of a woman. But for a lot of people with a lot of cinema in general, that's what's so great about it, is you can explore all these worlds and these places that you'll never get to see in general, either because it's on the other side of the world or because it's just completely fictional and some science fiction universe. So I think cinema is just so powerful, not only for letting people explore things they wouldn't be able to explore in general, but also for documenting history that needs to be continued to be told, with obviously Germany's past, and Wenders being a very key part of that with the new German cinema movement.
Yeah, I actually love that you bring up cinema as a whole and art as a motif for this movie. I wasn't going to say that, but I mean, now that I'm thinking about it, did you notice that Wenders dedicated the film to three, I mean, he called them angels?
Yep. So
Yeah,
Ozu, Truffaut, and Tarkovsky were the three at the end that he dedicated this to, which I think just
interesting.
further, while I'm watching, I'm like, man, this is really kind of showing the importance of translating what you're experiencing for yourself, like through the eyes of Wenders, being able to, I mean, if you think about his career and his life, his travels are immense. Like, we see Perfect Days, which we'll talk about later. It takes place in Japan. We have Paris, Texas, and other films taking place in America. He's traveling all throughout the world, all throughout Europe, has all these experiences and seen all these people and learn all these things. But then to be able to translate that into actual cinema for people to see and for people to hear these stories and take on for themselves is very powerful. And then, yeah, it kind of just all gets nailed down at the very end of this movie when he says, dedicated to all these former angels, but especially to Yasuhiro Ozu, Francois Truffaut, and Andrei Tarkovsky.
Yeah, and the thing is that when I first watched it and saw that dedication and then re-watched the movie, you could tell that there are glimmers of these filmmakers throughout. I mean, the Ozu one, I think it's obvious. It looks at the domestic, or the domestic that Damiel wants. Many of Ozu's movies were domestic or familial dramas. Then with the Truffaut one, that one's also kind of apparent. If you've seen a bunch of Truffaut's movies, I think it's the love for children. And the one thing throughout Winds of Desire is that the only humans that see these angels are
Mm-hmm.
children, as we said. And Truffaut loved this perceptiveness and innocence that children carried. So I would say that was his tribute to Truffaut. And then Tarkovsky, that was, I think, the most difficult one for me to kind
Mhm.
of suss out. I think the one thing that I can think of is the theme of freedom in Tarkovsky's movies and how that connects to Wings of Desire, freedom and choice, maybe. Or maybe it's just as simple as the motif of spirituality with the angels, because obviously spirituality was a big part of Tarkovsky's work. But that's kind of all I pulled from for that one. Is there anything else from these influences that you can think of?
From my research, I can say you kind of sound like you nailed on the head in terms of the Tarkovsky, because from everything I've read, everyone's kind of saying
Oh,
like
nice.
definitely of the three, the least influences are apparent in Wenders films as opposed to like Truffaut and like Ozu is obviously like the number one influence for
Hmm.
Wenders, but Tarkovsky, from everything I was reading for connections, a lot of people were saying like, yeah, there's clearly like the least clear influence on Wenders films, but obviously probably a very meaningful and impactful filmmaker to him as he continued to develop his own style of cinema.
There's a great interview with Wenders that he did with BFI. I don't know if you came across that, where he discusses that because these angels in the movie don't have pasts, they had to express as much as they could and their love of people through their eyes. And I think that they capture that love so well, especially Damiel. And Wenders saw the angels as metaphors for better versions of ourselves we have inside us, or I guess more specifically, the children that we have inside us. So back to that idea with Truffaut. But the quote I wanted to share with you is, quote, "We had to make sure the camera looked at the world lovingly. We can all do it. We just need to make an effort." End quote. And this stuck out to me because I feel like he looks at the world lovingly again with Perfect Days. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, Perfect Day is like the best example, like of all movies. I feel like in terms of like looking lovingly at the world and life, and then being able to find joy and pleasure and everything from a simple soda from a vending machine to
Yeah.
your career and your profession. But we can we'll get more into that, I'm sure, of course. But yeah,
Soon.
for sure. But yeah, another thing, kind of a quote that I had written down from Wings of Desire is Cassile saying that their purpose of these angels is to assemble, testify, and preserve reality. And I feel like that just kind of further is, I mean, there's so many themes in this movie. That's why I feel like this is like a true, just like opus of all opuses for Wenders, because we get not only so much commentary about the massive change Germany's going through at the time. You obviously get, the typical like angel overlooking story, and the concept of humanity
Mm.
and what people are, which we've seen in films before with like, It's a Wonderful Life as a yearly watch for most people. But beyond that, you also get these themes of Germany. You also get, and I feel like that assemble, testify, preserve quote is really kind of hammering home why this is dedicated to three filmmakers that were big influences on him, because he's been so traveled. He's assembling these life experiences, preserving the history of Germany and telling these stories. We see, like I mentioned, Peter Falk is the film they're making in Germany is about the city's Nazi past. So preserving this history through cinema and the importance of that. That's why I just think Wings of Desire is just pretty much just a perfect movie, because there's so many themes it tries to tackle, and it just nails them all.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and I'm happy that you bring up that sort of history of Germany as well. And I feel like it is a layered movie because for a movie that kind of starts at its core as a meditation on Berlin, which is, I mean, if you look at the description, that's what it seems like. But then you watch the film, and it turns out to be so much more. You get this compassionate look at life, what it means to be human, through the eyes of our central, lonely, wandering soul. And yeah, I mean, I agree with you. There's so much to pull from this. It really is just a phenomenal, phenomenal film in his
Mhm.
filmography. But yeah, anything else you want to add to Wings of Desire? Or should we move on to our final movie of the day?
As excited as I am for Perfect Days, there's one final thing I do want to ask about Wings of Desire, and that's
Yes.
the thing that, and it surprised me again, even though I knew it was coming on rewatch, is the end when it says "to be continued." It just took me by such surprise the first time I watched it, because I thought it was such a perfect movie on its own respects. And I know you've seen it. I still have not seen Far Away So Close, but I was so shocked to see there was a "to be continued." I was like, this is like a perfect movie. What's the deal here? And so I kind of your thoughts
Yeah,
on that, the fact that this was from the beginning, like, we see movies that didn't seem like they need sequels have sequels later, but this is like in the film, like like he always was planning on a part two. So I don't know. I just
mhm.
wanted your thoughts on that. And especially since you have seen the part two.
Ugh, I don't know. It really, really hurts my heart that there was a sequel. I mean, it's fine. It's a fine movie, but I completely agree with you. There was no need for it. The sequel, if you ever do get around to it, it's a lot more thematically cruel than Wings of Desire. Like it's pretty much, if you want me to tell you just very, very briefly, it's Cassiel now becoming human. And his
Mm.
path is completely different to what Damiel had, where Damiel ends up, you find out he's married to the trapeze artist. He has this like wonderful life. Castiel takes a completely wrong turn into just this like seedy world. And I don't know. I feel like I am just going forward, just going to block that out of my mind that even exists, because I agree with you. The ending for Wings of Desire is just so beautiful. And I don't know. It should just stay that way in all of our minds. I
Hmm.
do remember there was a reason why he did a sequel. Now I can't remember. It's not coming to me. I'm going to have to text you after and tell you. Yeah, I can't remember why he did it, but he did for whatever reason.
Yeah,
I
odd.
will say Willem Dafoe is great in it.
That is the
So
main draw that
there's
makes me
that.
want to watch it for sure. But when I was researching Wings of Desire, like one of the big things is that, obviously these are angels. So like spirituality and religion is obviously going to be inherently going to be a theme when you're talking about angels, but they never mention God or get so explicit about
Hmm.
religion in Wings of Desire where, and again, I haven't seen it, but what the article I was reading was mentioning was saying Far Away So Close really doesn't do
Oh
that. They
yeah.
start to really make them more religious themes. So I don't know if Wenders felt more moved to tie religion more into the film, as because we kind of mentioned Wings of Desire already has so many things that they're tackling, whereas religion, as crazy as it sounds for a movie about two angels watching over a city, religion might be like the fourth or fifth theme of this movie because there's just so many other things that are just so heavily impactful. Maybe he felt like he needed to do more with that. I don't know, but Willem Dafoe being in it is definitely like the main draw for me wanting to watch the sequel.
For sure. The one sad thing about the sequel is it's very, very long. You really got to commit to it. I think it's like 2.5 hours. So knowing what you know from what I just told you, I know it's not going to be that enticing to watch this movie that's not as good as the first one for
Yeah.
2.5 hours. But I think I was reading briefly, and now again, I don't know why my memory is just failing me right now entirely. But I think it also may have something to do with Wenders as well and his own stance on religion. That could be why he decided to make the sequel and make it more religious, but don't quote me on that. That's just, I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. But anyway, final movie of the day, Perfect Days. You really connected with this one, obviously, as you were
Mm-hmm.
saying. Did you go into your first watching experience of this movie completely blind, or like what did you know? Because it floored you.
I, I was completely blind because I was fortunate enough to be partnered with Neon to where they sent me their like end of year screeners pack. So before it ever came out in theaters, I saw it. So none of my mutuals like had seen Perfect Days or like I haven't heard any reactions from it. So I went in like completely blind, and I was actually watching it like just around the new year, and I was like, this couldn't be a more perfect like New Year's watch and something that like I know I'm gonna watch religiously like once every like half year or so, just because it is so personal to me, and it's there's so much more that you can kind of pull from me personally to like just remind myself to reconnect with things in a better way. But yeah, I went in completely blind my first watch of it and was astonished.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's just such a beautiful film. Just this reminder to pay attention to the little things around you, to appreciate them. And with our lead, which we'll get into, of course, he carries so much visible pain, yet he doesn't ever say anything about it. He just still gets up every day, still keeps going, still maintains that positivity. And I think that's just so important to be reminded of. Just like how you said, it's a movie that I'm absolutely going to revisit time and time again. But yeah,
Mhm,
some background info before we get into Perfect Days.
mhm.
As we said, this movie is essentially Wenders' ode to Ozu and Japan. And he first discovered Ozu in the mid 70s. He first saw Tokyo Story and he watched more movies, and he was just taken aback by the way Ozu told his stories. And he's gone on many times to call Ozu his master. He's obviously paid tribute to Japan and Ozu himself, as we mentioned, with Tokyo Ga in 1985. And then in 1989, he made Notebook on Cities and Clothes, which I
Mm.
haven't seen. It's another documentary on the legendary fashion designer Yohji Yamamoto. And he also worked with Ozu's most beloved actor, Shishu Ryu, in a small role for Wenders' film Until the End of the World in 1991. I haven't seen that either, but I really want to. But anyway, fast forward to Perfect Days in late December of 2021. Wenders was really missing Japan. He wanted to go back. He obviously loves the country. And he suddenly got invited to Tokyo to see these art installations made by various architects, and they were public toilets. Do you know this story, Tyler, of how all this came to be?
Yeah, when I went in my first watch, I didn't, but yeah, he was invited by Koji Yanai, who was the
Mhm.
kind of leader of the project of the Tokyo toilet, which is I believe it's like 17 different toilets that are, you see them throughout the movie. These are these
Hmm.
like designer boutique restrooms that are out in public for everyone to use, but these are completely lavish and luxurious. And he was invited by the founder of the project to come and just make a short film on each of them, I believe. And it's kind of like the history of them being built and what the purpose of the Tokyo Toilet Project is. But yeah, it's just kind of such a weird way that Perfect Days came to be, that initially it was like this Tokyo Toilet Project. He's going to make like 17 short films. And now it turned into this feature film they decided to do instead, which shows the beauty of the toilets and the Tokyo Toilet Project. And definitely, like, he's wearing the jumper that has the name of it on the back. So you're going to look into it, which is like probably the objective of Koji and I, is to bring awareness to the project and get people to be interested in visiting them, which I think is accomplished by this film without outright being like a promotion of these toilets that they're building in Tokyo. It's like, if I go to Tokyo, like, I'm going to try and check off all of them on my list now because of that. And I think that's just like the beauty of, I mean, this is a form of advertising, yes, for the Tokyo Toilet Project, which I think again is what Koji and I was planning the entire time by inviting Wim Wenders to come and create some cinema about him, but turned it into Perfect Days. And just a weird way of this film to come to be, which I think is just kind of perfect for what the film ends up being, just how you kind of just take life as it comes and through the ups and downs, just make something out of it. And toilets in general are something that usually people think are grimy and ugly and dirty, and you'd think are disgusted by the concept of cleaning them every day, but you never even see him once, I don't think, show any disgust towards them or be grossed out. And he just really just takes life on the chin no matter what and just pushes on through.
Yeah, exactly. And I just love the collaboration that came to be with this, because you're right. The initial idea was to change the perception of public toilets in Tokyo and the grossness, obviously, as you were saying, that we all associate with them. And so vendors were supposed to make short documentaries of these toilets. And it was honestly thanks to him that it got changed into a feature film, because he loved the idea of these installations. He thought they were beautiful, which they are, but he wanted to show off their meaning and purpose in a fictional film instead. So I'd be curious to see what it would have looked like if it was a documentary, but I think this was absolutely the way to go. And he said to the folks behind the project, he said, I love Tokyo and I want to do a film that deals with toilets in a more metaphorical sense and to cherish the common good that exists here. Said something like that. It's not a direct quote. And so he compared this film to his work on Wings of Desire, where he said that similar to how the angels were used to show Berlin the way he wanted to show it, he wanted a caretaker for these toilets, someone who can dignify the job itself. As you said, our lead here never complains about what he's doing, and someone who basically embodied what vendors saw through this project. And that's, again, that common good in Japan, this mutual respect for the city and for each other. So he wanted a character who signified that. And that's how Hirayama came to be in Perfect Days. And yeah, I guess that's kind of the backstory of the movie, but that's so cool. I love that story. You're completely right as well. So what is Perfect Days about for those who haven't seen it? We basically follow the day-to-day life of Hirayama, played by the incredible Koji Yakusho, who Bender sees as the best actor in Japan at the moment. I also love him. He's in Tampopo, which is one of my favorite comfort movies. He's also been in Kiyoshi Kurosawa's movies, so Cure, Pulse. Any other roles of his that you love, Tyler?
I'm looking through filmography right now, and honestly, okay, so he's also in, well, I don't know how much I can trust his filmography. He's also in Babel from 2006, which is Alejandro Inarritu's film with Brad Pitt
Yeah,
in it.
I don't remember that one
He's
much.
yeah, I think that's the thing, which is why it's so awesome to highlight him in this, because he's in, Cure, which is a film Seth keeps telling me to watch. I need to get on
It's
it, but I
so
mean,
good.
but looking at his filmography was like jumping out. He's in so many films. I'm like, I didn't even realize he was in that, but like,
Yeah.
especially like Babel. But yeah, no, he was my favorite performance of last year, bar none. Like, in terms of just pure acting, and blew me away in this movie. And he doesn't. And it's the same thing, which I forgot to mention with Paris, Texas, with Harry Dean Stanton, which no one really ever has it come to their mind to be like best acting performance of all time, because it's not like the typical, like, you can't make a fun montage edit of it. There's no epic outburst
Yeah.
moments, there's no boiling over scenes where you have to be acting at your biggest. But Harry Dean Stanton's so quiet and quaint and perfect for that role that I really don't know if anyone could have done it the way he did. And that's the same thing you could say here for this performance of Koji Yakusho, where again, there's not really those outburst scenes. There's like, there's a couple emotional moments, but this is a very quiet performance by him that's done with such care that I don't really know if anyone could be able to pull it off either.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I have some stuff that I will add to that later, but yes, I could not agree more. This just floored me. It was probably, yeah, my favorite performance of 2023, but so I also want to highlight that Hirayama, that in itself is a nod to Ozu and the family name in Tokyo Story. I can't remember. Have you seen Tokyo Story, Tyler?
I'm not. I don't
Not
know if I
yet.
want to watch. So I've Tokyo Ga is like on my very near term watch list, but and I don't know if I want to use that as my introduction to Ozu. If I want to watch more Ozu and then go into Tokyo Ga, or
I
what
would.
order I want to do it. But that's like the, we say Paris, Texas, kind of like the Wim Wenders film that everyone kind of starts with. I feel like Tokyo Story is kind of like, that for Ozu, where that's kind of like the one people go to when they start.
Absolutely. I think it'll also even just, if it's even possible, because I know you love Perfect Days, I think it'll also help you love Perfect Days even more. But so, yeah, so Hirayama, it's a nod to the family name in Tokyo Story. And yeah, as we were saying, Hirayama in Perfect Days, he barely speaks throughout the film, very rarely. He lives this life of solitude. We don't know much about him besides his daily routine. He loves his cassette collection and listens to just tons of oldies. It's Lou Reed, Patti Smith. The whole soundtrack is a complete banger, don't you agree?
Mm-hmm.
It's
Perfect
just
soundtrack. Yeah, I got the Rolling Stones in
perfect.
there, the Animals. Perfect soundtrack. Every time he got in his car in the morning and plopped in a new tape, I just couldn't wait to see what was going to be coming on
Same.
next.
He's usually singing the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so he has his cassette tapes. He also has his books. He reads Faulkner. I can't remember any other authors. I think there's one more, but Faulkner for sure. And he also loves his film photography and photographs nature and trees. And he has his little plant collection. And this is all of the stuff that he does when he's not driving around town scrubbing toilets. As we were saying, he never complains about his life. And even when some shitty things happen to him, like when his car runs out of gas and he gave his coworker all his money for a date, he has to sell a tape of his, a beloved tape of his. And he never complains. And so we watch his life without him saying anything to us. And we get pockets of who he is and the life that he came from and the people that he impacts throughout. And the reason why I'm saying all this is because it's all shown through Koji Yakusho's eyes, really. Like it's crazy how much he's able to convey with his eyes. Anything you want to add here?
No, I mean his eyes, the way they brim with excitement and joy from looking up at the sky, hearing the birds chirp, and the emotion when he eventually, later in the film, his sister comes and they reconnect. The sadness you see, like you said, I don't know the word count, but he doesn't say much words in this movie whatsoever. And another one that I love the moment is when he's in the car with what's the name, Aya, I believe is the name of the girlfriend of Takashi,
Mm-hmm.
when he's kind of witnessing her loving the music that he loves so much, and appreciating the tape as opposed to Spotify or whatever. Like eventually I think like is it his niece is the one who comes
Yep.
later? Would that be, yeah, so niece. Just appreciation, just what he can show with his eyes of his love for life, and love not only for his own life, even though we kind of in very small nuggets get to kind of get some backstory on some of the pain we've seen from him. But for the most part, he kind of just bottles up that pain. We don't, as a viewer, get to see too much of it on our own side. And he just has so much love for life shown through his eyes without words, for not only what he sees in his own day-to-day life, but in other people that get to experience life, like Aya, and even in his coworker, who is kind of a mess, but he's still like, that's why he gives him the money. He's like, you're young and naive, and he sees his coworker bonding with, I can't remember if that was his younger brother, if it was just someone who was like a family friend who would
I
visit
think it's
him at
just a
that one
friend.
toilet at work. And he just loves seeing life through his own eyes, and he loves seeing other people experience life as well. You see the homeless man by the tree as well, that he kind of observes every day. And yeah, just so much of it's done without saying a single word, and that's just so beyond impressive.
I completely agree. And one of the reasons why I picked this movie for the trio today, I mean, obviously because it's a new release and because we love it so much, but because it's still on theme with the other two movies, where Hirayama does carry a lot of pain, even if he doesn't complain. And like as you said, we get nuggets of this, of figuring out what happened in his past life. And we noticed that something bad did happen to him once, to Hirayama, because at one point we meet his estranged sister, who appears in a limo. I think it was a limo, or maybe it was just a very expensive looking car,
Mm-hmm.
but she's driven by a chauffeur. And she explains that their father is in the hospital and he's not doing well. Kind of leads us to think that there was this huge family falling out. And she clearly isn't in touch with him because she's A, shocked by where he lives, and B, she has no idea, or she had no idea, that he was a toilet cleaner. I think she sees his jumpsuit. And so after she
Mm-hmm.
leaves, he finally breaks down and cries. And it's one of the very few moments in the film where he cries. And so there's baggage there. And it's kind of similar, to me at least, to Travis in Paris, Texas, where Wenders captures this really fragile loneliness. Also similar to Wings of Desire, he also shows the same sensibility towards compassion. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like in Paris, Texas, we get a little more of Travis's backstory when they have that conversation at the Peep Show, where we can kind of understand some of these like darkness and heaviness that he's been holding in as he kind of releases it all, and then we kind of understand the relationship past. Whereas Perfect Days, we get small nuggets. We know that his father's in a nursing home, and there's some sort of family falling out where it doesn't seem like he sees them that often. His sister's driven in a chauffeur. He's cleaning toilets, living in like a nice, but like clearly not up to the standard of what his sister would be liking for a home or an apartment. So we kind of get the idea that they either came from some sort of money, or he used to be someone that was successful or more successful in terms of what, the stereotype of successful, where people think, higher paying job, corporate executive or something, and had money. And now something happened in his life to where now maybe cleaning toilets is the only job that he was able to get. Like, we don't know. We don't get much uncovered. Whereas Paris, Texas, I feel like gives us a little more of that exposition. But all we really get is that, his father's in the nursing home. Doesn't seem like he has much more time. And we can kind of infer that there's some rift in that family. But you can tell from the whole movie that he's harboring some, not darkness, but heaviness throughout his soul throughout this entire movie that he's trying to reconcile with, and seems to be managing pretty well. But clearly there's so much more to that backstory of him that we don't really get outright told to us, but we know is just so heavy and weighing on him. And he's able to still find joy in the everyday of life, and capturing it through his camera, or fostering the life of these plants, or, when he has his niece there, kind of just having just a ball of a time with her, but when she's not there, kind of living that same thing through, I think Takashi was his name I mentioned. Yeah, Takashi and Aya. So just, there's something in that backstory that we just don't really kind of know, but there's some darkness there and something that happened in his past that we kind of know is under the surface, but he's still managing to find the joy in everyday life regardless.
I'm also really curious because I think that the final scene in the film says a lot. The shot of him driving to Nina Simone's Feeling Good. He's like crying and smiling. What do you make of that?
It's almost as if, like, I don't know if I want to draw a complete one-to-one comparisons between that and Paris, Texas, but there's some similarities there where is in the end of Perfect Days, you have his sister and his niece, and it's kind of like almost the opposite. Instead of like in Paris, Texas, there's a little bit of reconnection, but in this, his sister says like, our father doesn't have much time left. And even if you go see him now, he's probably not going to remember you, I believe is what she says. So clearly his mind's going and he's not in a good state. And he says, like, no, I'm not going to go see him. And it's almost as if that was like a decision that was weighing on him for so long, his family being something that weighs on him for so long. But, he found his sister's doing fine. And the niece that she's raising, or her daughter, his niece that she's raising is seems well adjusted to the world and has a good head on her shoulders. And he's at peace with the fact that he's never going to see his father again. And I think making those final decisions, which you could infer was just in his head, always bouncing around, like, should I see my dad or not again? Should I not? Will my sister be embarrassed of me or think less of me because I work at a toilet, like, or not? But that all becomes real, and he can kind of put that away and bury that. And now he has, kind of the nuisance coworker's gone. It seems like he's got like a very hard worker as a new coworker, listens, feeling good. He has that kind of a feel like he can kind of button up all those pasts with his family, and, can kind of just carry on the rest of his days happy with the fact that he's not carrying all this emotional baggage anymore. So I think there's a lot of definitely parallels you can draw to, Travis's story and the end of Paris, Texas, even though different in the delivery, but, a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, honestly, I love that interpretation and that answer to the question because I completely agree with you. I think during my second watch, I found that ending even more relatable than the first time. Just the moments like that, I'm sure so many people have had them where you're carrying so much emotional weight and you're processing it and you're just trying to, as you said, find peace with the journey that you're on. And again, back to Koji Yakusho and his eyes, just so much is expressed through his eyes in that scene. It's a close up. It's just incredible. And just throughout the entire movie, he comes across as the most kind-hearted and gentle man. And that's all done with his acting with his face.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was a huge thing that I picked up on during the rewatch, is just how incredible he is and how he's able just to convey so much with so little.
Yeah. I mean, because you think of his apartment, he has a couple books, his lamp, and his little mat bed, and then he has some plants, and that's really kind of about it. And then his daily life is pretty much rinse and repeat of wake up, water his plants, get a soda from the vending machine, drive to work, clean the toilets, kind of then come home, ride his bike, go to a restaurant, and read his book and go to bed. Like it's kind of a rinse and repeat kind of day, but he finds so much joy in that. And he finds so much joy in life, even though we don't know again what his kind of backstory was or what kind of led him to this spot in his life. But he finds so much joy in just, the mundane and just the routine, which I think is just like a perfect film for 2023 because, coming out recently, because we live in a society now with internet and technology where you're always comparing yourself to other people and feeling like you're behind or feeling like, someone's more successful than you or someone's more pretty than you or someone's in better shape than you or more money than you. Like you're always comparing yourself. So being able to find beauty in just the routine of life where, you see all these influencers that are, flying all around the world having the ball, but, you're stuck with a 9-to-5 job, but being able to find beauty in that and the routine and knowing that there's comfort you can find in that is just such a message we all need. And that's why it's something I'm going to be rewatching, every 6 months or so, because it's just, Hirayama is like everything I'm not in terms of like, I'm always stressing. I'm always planning. I'm always trying to do a million things at a time. I feel like I'm not getting any satisfaction because I always have to climb to the next milestone. But, he's able to just be content. And that's something that I struggle with. So it's like, that's why this film is just like therapy for me, a 2-hour therapy session that is underscored by a killer soundtrack. So it's really, pretty enjoyable time to watch and remind yourself of these things. But that's why this film for me, like, people always talk about objective or subjective with films and like, if you like something more, if it's better or whatever, and film's subjective. So there's nothing that really means, but like if I had to say like, I think Wings of Desire, I guess I'll say is his opus. I think it's like his best work that I've seen of his is Wings of Desire, but like Perfect Days is such like an emotional attachment to me that like, that's going to be like my number one, my favorite. But yeah, Perfect Days is just so personal and special that I love that film, and I can't wait to just continue falling in love with it the more and more I rewatch it.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I completely agree with you with the motifs. I'm the same way as you. I'm always go, 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 and I think that's why the message of Perfect Days is so beautiful. Just to be at peace with your journey, and
Mm-hmm.
just enjoy the process.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also important to touch on another motif in the film. I mean, obviously not as important, but the music itself that Hirayama listens to, which we mentioned briefly, because Wenders has also said that each song was specifically picked for a reason and that the lyrics can help guide us since Hirayama doesn't say much in the movie. And especially that final song by Nina Simone that we mentioned is so important because we see all the things Hirayama went through in the film, even that interaction he has with the dying man the night before. Oops, spoilers, I guess. And just the slew of things we don't know about his life. And throughout it all, Hirayama is reflecting in that final scene, as you said, and in the end comes to terms with the fact that it's a new day. And you see him go through that wave of emotions. So, yeah, I mean, are there any other songs that stick out to you as narrative guides?
I mean, you open the film with "The House of the Rising Sun" is the first one you hear. Just kind of sets the stage
Mm.
for this world we're getting a peek into. You obviously get "Perfect Day," which is obviously the titular name of the film, but also the song "Perfect Day" by Lou Reed of finding beauty in every single day that you live. Which Koji's kind of a master at this point, or Hirayama is a master at this point. And then "Perfect Day" coming back again, but feeling good is just like the perfect way to end this movie. That's why the ending is just so impactful and strong because it's just I have tears in my eyes. I'm smiling ear to ear at the same time. He's gone through this whole journey, which felt like, if you just break this film down and explain it to someone, like it just sounds like a pretty mundane, boring film. Like it's like, oh yeah, you watch for 2 hours, you see this guy scrub toilets. His coworker's kind of a dunce and, he connects with his family, but not really much happens there. You don't really get a whole lot of info. He goes to a bathhouse. Like, it's kind of just narratively from a plot point. You kind of look at this film and you're like, oh, like, not much happens, but, and dialogue wise, you're like, yeah, only like 12 words are spoken the entire time from our main character. But you have these songs that are kind of carrying you through narratively his mindset. You have Sleepy City is one, or Walking Through the Sleepy City is another song. Looking at it's just, they're kind of conveying the narrative through the soundtrack, which, we mentioned at the beginning, like Wim Wenders, it's not like Perfect Day is the first time he's ever had a killer soundtrack, and all of his films he takes a lot of pride in making incredible songs because he always has great taste. And yeah, it's just fascinating. And I don't know many films I can think of to compare to that. The soundtrack has so much, the soundtrack's almost like a supporting actor in this, where it's like carrying the narrative forward through the dialogue of the lyrics of the song, which is, it's hard for me to think of another one I could compare it to where I think a soundtrack has been that pivotal to the story.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm trying to think of something else right now. But yeah, in terms of being pivotal to the story, Wenders probably does it best. But I also
Mhm.
want to jump back to you mentioning how minimal the movie is in terms of plot, because that's a huge association with Ozu, who is obviously the biggest inspiration to this movie. Because Ozu, that was the biggest part of his work, was this minimalistic approach to storytelling and the focus on someone's daily life. Even the aspect ratio of the film is a nod to Ozu, and
Mhm.
the scenes that are shot on a tatami mat level height in Hirayama's home, that's also a nod back to Ozu. But the most important thing is that beauty in the mundane, because Ozu was a master of that. And I think that Wenders also captures the beauty in the mundane as well with Perfect Days so well. I also want to point out that the movie made, or Perfect Days made history as being the first time a non Japanese filmmaker has been nominated to represent the country at the Academy Awards.
Mhm.
And they lost to Zone of Interest, right? I believe that
Yeah, this is
was.
a really weird year for best international film because it was like every single movie had a story similar to Perfect Days, where like Vendors is like a German production and a film in Japan, but then like Zone of Interest was a British production, but it's like obviously
Oh,
a very German
right.
Polish
Yeah,
film,
yeah.
and then Society of the Snow was I don't want to get it wrong. I think it might be Spain, but it's obviously a Uruguayan story
Hmm.
that takes place in those Alps, but it's like it was like every single film this past year. So like I know Perfect Days
Interesting.
broke the record for the first non-Japanese director to get a Japanese nod, but it was like every film had this weird thing where it's like a country producing a film based on a story of a different country. A lot of odd. It was just like a weird, quirky year for that. But yeah, it did lose the Zone of
Ah,
Interest.
I didn't even think of. I'm so happy you brought that up because you're right, and I didn't even think of that,
Mm-hmm.
especially with those other two movies. Yeah, you're right. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for that.
Yeah.
But yeah, to slowly wrap Perfect Days, and then I'll let you say some thoughts about it as well. But during this watch, I picked up on an interesting similarity with Paris, Texas. Or did you mention it already? I think you did, where at the end of Paris, Texas, Travis drives away smiling to himself, and Hirayama does the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you did mention that.
Not explicitly part of the smiling driving away. I made connection about the ending, but yeah, no, go on because I think you're adding to the point I made earlier, so it's good addition.
Oh, good, good, good. The thing that I wanted to add is Vendor said that the final scene where Travis leaves Jane and Hunter behind in Paris, Texas, marked the beginning of the next chapter of his own filmography,
Mm.
which we also kind of covered earlier. But it makes me wonder. I guess this is more so not really a thought, it's like an open ended question. It makes me wonder if he felt a similar sort of liberation at the end of Perfect Days. I guess I'm just really curious what he's going to do next because they're similar.
If you, I don't know, it's almost worrisome looking at it through that lens because it's technically sunrise, I think, is at the beginning of the day. But I was like, because at first I was like, the sun, I was like, is he riding off into the sunset? Is he saying this is his swan song? And be like, I don't, that's not the case at the end of the movie, but it could be. But I think it's definitely regardless closing a chapter because I mean, I guess at the time of production, you couldn't know if there's going to be the success it ended up being, getting nominated for Oscars. But we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, he was not critically getting successes for decades. So I don't know, maybe Perfect Days is like closing this chapter of this, and he kind of knows his path going forward. Now that he's kind of reconnected with Japan, maybe. But yeah, I think it's definitely symbolic of closing a chapter. I just hope it's not like closing a chapter of producing movies in general.
I doubt that. No, no, no. He
Yes.
released that documentary, I think, the same year as Perfect Days. I haven't seen it yet. I can't think of the name right now, but he
Mhm.
did release a documentary around the same time as Perfect Days. But yeah,
Mm.
anything you want to add to that film specifically before we wrap up?
Just another thing I kind of like notice it. Well, so I think we talked about a lot of similarities between Perfect Days and Paris, Texas, but I think there's also the same themes that I was kind of touching on with the Wings of Desire, themes of the importance of capturing things for future generations and the importance of cinema. I mean, we don't necessarily see like, Hirayama be a filmmaker, but he's capturing things with images and he takes great pride in capturing things with images each and every day. And we kind of get that nugget where his father, isn't doing well, probably won't remember anything. He doesn't want to see him. So I feel like there's just kind of more themes there, maybe not as blatant as there was in Wings of Desire of Wim Wenders wanting to make commentary on capturing things for memory's sake. Like I think maybe Hirayama is starting to, in his own mind, like we can assume that he knew his father's condition was bad before his sister said it's gotten worse, but in his mind, he might have already known this whole time throughout the movie that his father's memory's going. He's not remembering things as much. So he's starting to take pictures, and maybe he's just more recently starting to enjoy the mundane more because he knows that life is fleeting and the importance of remembering things, capturing things, and finding joy in all these things. And we kind of also see that with the shadow tag scene, which I thought was So beautiful
Yes.
of the, I believe it's the restaurant owner's husband, or maybe they own it
Yes.
together, but he's dying of cancer. And I just used it in my Letterboxd review today, the opening quote of it. So I got to pull that up. I have it like right here. But the quote he says is, he's kind of musing on, he's talking about shadows. He's like, well, if a shadow overlaps with another shadow, is that going to be, does that make a darker shadow? And then to kind of conclude that thought, which is like a silly thought of like, oh, two shadows overlap, is it darker? He says, so many things I still don't know. That's how life ends, I guess. And it's just such a sad and tragic, but true. And it's just a fact that like a lot of us bury and don't want to confront the fact that, like you're not going to explore everything you want to explore. You're not going to learn everything you want to learn. You're not going to see every movie you want to see in your lifetime. And that's just kind of how what life is, and being able to find beauty in the fact that you're not going to accomplish everything or do everything you want to do, and being able to find joy in that. Like this guy just professed his darkness and grappling with the fact that he's about to die. And Hirayama's response is, well, if you want to know if the shadow gets darker, let's go right now. Let's stand in this light and let's figure it out. Like just being able to find comfort in such terrifying concepts is what just makes Perfect Day such a beautiful film to me.
Yeah, I love that you chose to end it on that, because that's the beauty of this movie and the beauty of Wenders' work. I think that all three of the films we talked about today are so compassionate in their own ways. They're so human, and yeah, they all carry this air of melancholy that's just prevalent throughout. So they really leave you with a lot to mull over about life and humanity, as you said. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed today's chat as much as I did, Tyler.
I had a great time with it. For our podcast, we yap for 2.5 hours about just nonsense the whole time and just silliness. And I don't ever do nearly as much prep and research as I do for this. And I had a great time with it,
Thank
honestly. Like I
you.
may need to do some more of it in the future, because it's so much more fun to explore the connection between what you see on the screen and the lives of the people behind the lens. This was a fun time, a great chat. People think like talking movies can be like nerding out, but I mean, like what me and you, our history of me and you talking to each other is like, we talk about taxes and accounting. So like, this is a blast to talk about like films, like instead of talking about like finances and like how to put receipts for things. Like this is a way more exciting conversation than the normal text we have back and forth about taxes. So I love talking about, I guess it's a quote from Everything Ever All at Once, like do laundry and taxes. So yeah, you can find beauty in the mundane there too, but definitely way more fun talking Wim Wenders than just talking about tax season.
I completely agree with you. And honestly, you are more than welcome to come back on for any other connections we want to make with some of our favorite filmmakers. So, yeah, thank you so much. And is there anything you want to shout out, your socials or Real Talk or anything at all?
Yeah, just check out the ReelTok podcast. Reel spelled like a film reel and talk spelled like TikTok. Check us out. We have new podcasts every single week. Checking out Marta's awesome podcast. I think Seth has been on a couple times. George, by the time
Yep.
this comes out, will George have been on it as well? Okay, so yeah, we get
George's episode is launching tomorrow or next week. Next week.
gotcha. So it's
So
not out for me, but by the time this comes out, it's probably been out for several months because Marta's such a superstar at getting so much stuff prepped in the future. But I had a blast. The one Wim Wenders quote I'll leave it on is, the more opinions you have, the less you see. And during my research, I saw that quote from him, and I really, really like it. The more opinions you have, the less you see. And yeah, I appreciate you having me on. I had a great time.
of course, I love that quote. I'm going to be mulling that over, and I hope everybody else does too. So, yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and I hope to have you back. Bye, Tyler.
Have a good one.